Information session Thursday, June 5th at 6 p.m. Instant admission decision available for qualified candidates. Details at cabrini.edu or 610-902-8500. Cabrini College. Do something extraordinary.
You're listening to WHYY FM Philadelphia, your member-supported news and information station, serving Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Good morning. It's 9:59. It is Wednesday morning. I'm Brenda Jarrett. Hope you got a lot out of BBC NewsHour and Morning Edition today. And Radio Times is next for you. The Franklin Institute forecast sunshine. It's less humid and 73 your high today. 49 tonight and clear. Sunny and 77 Thursday. Friday sunshine, then increasing clouds and up to 78. It's 59 in Center City.
From WHYY in Philadelphia, this is Radio Times. I'm Marty Moss-Coane. Ever since Israel's founding, American presidents and their administrations have been involved in trying to resolve conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians. President Bush has vowed to hammer out a solution by the end of his term, although that prediction has been called wildly unrealistic. U.S. policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become an issue in the presidential race, with candidates staking out different positions. Coming up, is peace possible in the Middle East? Our guests are former U.S. Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer and Ghaith al Omari, former advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Stay with WHYY in Philadelphia. First News from National Public Radio.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Carl Castle. There's mixed news today on the health of the nation's economy. Orders for durable goods dropped last month, but some tech sectors showed signs of strength. NPR's Dave Mattingly reports.
Orders for big-ticket items were off 0.5% in April. The drop was fueled by steep declines in demand for commercial aircraft, down more than 24%, and new cars, off more than 3%. But analysts say the overall decline was not as sharp as they'd expected, and they note that excluding transportation, orders rose by 2.5%. That's the biggest gain in 9 months. In addition, business orders for electrical equipment and appliances shot up by nearly 28%. Economists caution against reading too much into a single month's report. Tomorrow, the federal government reports its revised figure on gross domestic product for the first 3 months of the year. Dave Mattingly, NPR News, Washington.
China is still trying to cope following this month's deadly earthquake. The death toll is now more than 68,000, with almost 20,000 people listed as missing. NPR's Andrea Hsu has more from Chengdu.
It's been more than 2 weeks since the earthquake devastated this part of southwest China, and still nerves are frayed. After 2 powerful aftershocks yesterday, there were rumors today that another big one was on the way. State radio and television quickly debunked those rumors and sought to reassure people that Chengdu City is safe, despite continuing tremors. There is, however, growing concern for people living downstream of the Tangjiashan Lake. That lake was created as a result of landslides. More than 160,000 people have been evacuated from the area out of fears that the lake could burst. Meanwhile, China has appealed to Japan for relief supplies and transport. China is still in need of tents for the millions of people made homeless by the earthquake. Andrea Hsu, NPR News, Chengdu, China.
The new parliament speaker in Iran is warning that he may limit cooperation with the UN nuclear watchdog following a critical report from the agency. Ali Larijani was Iran's top nuclear negotiator, but today he was overwhelmingly elected as parliament speaker. Following that, he called a new report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was issued on Monday, deplorable. The report from the IAEA said Iran may be withholding information concerning attempts to make nuclear weapons. It is unclear what actions the parliament is considering. It could include less cooperation when it involves questions originating from Western intelligence agencies. Prices on Wall Street opened higher this morning and are higher still in early trading. At this hour, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 21 points to 12,569. The Nasdaq is up a fraction to 2482. This is NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from Saturn. Introducing the Outlook Crossover with seating for 8 and an EPA estimated 24 miles per gallon highway. Learn more at Saturn.com.
60 degrees. We head to a sunny 73. It's 10:04. Good morning. I'm Brenda Jarrett. WHYY News. Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey says criminal charges filed against 2 police officers shows police brutality will not be tolerated on the force. 29-year-old Sheldon Fitzgerald and 30-year-old Howard Hill, both 5-year veterans in the 25th District, are charged with beating a man who was painting graffiti on a wall last August. 36-year-old David Vernitsky was allegedly caught writing a message of congratulations to a couple whose wedding he'd attended, and the officers allegedly caught Vernitsky after he tried to run away, then beat him. Police spokesman Lieutenant Frank Van Oor says the lengthy internal probe ended with the decision by the DA to criminally charge the officers, who are suspended for 30 days with intent to dismiss.
Internal Affairs has been investigating it for a while. They turned it over to the District Attorney's Office, and then this is the District Attorney's Office conclusion for the criminal charges. So you got to remember this started in 2007, so it started a while ago.
The officers are also charged with covering up the beating, filing a false entry in their patrol log to show they were somewhere else at the time of the incident. The FOP president says the union will defend the 2 officers against the charges. The allegations come following discipline against 8 officers among a group caught on Fox 29 helicopter video beating 3 shooting suspects. The Atlantic hurricane season is beginning officially June 1st. Experts expect up to 9 named storms could develop into hurricanes, and Delaware emergency management officials are urging people to be prepared. Joe Thomas is the director of emergency operations in Sussex County, and he says Delaware remains an easy target for Atlantic storms, though nor'easters are more common along the coastline. While most of the first state's direct hits have come from nor'easters, now is the time for people closest to shorelines to get ready for summer storms and prepare the family disaster kit. In sports, the Phillies try to go for 3 in a row against those Colorado Rockies after winning again last night by a score of 7-4. It'll be Adam Eaton on the mound for the Phils. Sunshine, less humid as we head to a high of 73 today. Clear skies down to 49 tonight. Then Thursday, sunny skies and 77. Friday, sun, then increasing clouds and up to 78 degrees. 60 degrees, breezy here in Center City. It's 10:06.
Good morning. I'm Marty Moss-Coane. Welcome to Radio Times. The Annapolis Middle East Peace Conference was held 6 months ago in late November to try to jumpstart talks between Israelis and Palestinians and address their long-standing conflicts. Since that time, President Bush and other members of his administration have made trips to the Middle East and met with local leaders. Bush was in Israel for the country's 60th anniversary. He hosted Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas at the White House in April. There have also been meetings between the governments of Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas, and recently it was reported that Israel has been talking to Syria about border disputes, with Turkey acting as a broker. Today on Radio Times, with all these talks and meetings, what progress has been made, if any, on Middle East peace negotiations? What are the steps that should be taken? And what is the end game? Let me introduce our guests. And joining us from the studios of Princeton University is Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, former U.S. ambassador to Israel and Egypt under the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. He's a professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, co-author of a new book called Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East, and he's a foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama's presidential campaign. Ambassador Kurtzer, nice to have you back with us on Radio Times. Good morning.
Good morning, Marty. Good to be here.
Nice to have you here. Also with us is Ghaith al Omari. He's advocacy director of the American Task Force on Palestine. He was an advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and a Palestinian negotiator from 1999 to 2006. And Ghaith al Omari, nice to have you back with us on Radio Times as well. Good morning.
Thank you for having me again.
Let me begin with you, Ghaith al Omari. Has there been any progress in the last 6 months?
Yes, actually there has been. I mean, reports we're hearing from the Palestinians and Israelis is that the negotiations on the big issues, borders and Jerusalem and refugees, are making some progress. However, unfortunately, what has not happened is any change on the ground. And if you talk to the public, to your average Palestinians and Israelis, they see nothing that has changed in their lives. And so there is quite a lack of credibility for the diplomatic process.
Let me turn to you, Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer. Do you see progress?
I think there has been. In fact, I just arrived this morning from a trip to Israel where I had an opportunity to speak to both Israeli officials and to some Palestinian negotiators. And both sides are reporting, as Ghaith suggested, that there has been progress on the substantive issues being negotiated. I also do agree with Ghaith that the behavioral changes that were called for at the Annapolis summit have lagged far behind. Settlement activity, the freedom of movement issues on the Israeli side, more assertive policy against terrorism on the Palestinian side, these still need a lot more work on both sides.
But Daniel Kurtzer, Ghaith al Omari was saying, as far as the people are concerned, and I'm assuming, Ghaith, you're referring to the Palestinian people, their life hasn't changed much as a result of these conversations. Does that trouble you, Daniel Kurtzer?
Well, there's always going to be a gap between what happens in the closed doors of negotiations and its effect on populations. One of the promises of the Annapolis process is that the two activities would go hand in hand. The negotiators would negotiate, and the people would be able to see some changes on the ground. And that's the area where I think much more attention needs to be paid.
To you, Ghaith al Omari, and I know there was a meeting recently, some business people from other parts of the world came and talked about more economic development in the Palestinian territories. What do you make of that?
Actually, I mean, that was one of the few items of good news that we've been hearing recently. I mean, this was a conference that was specifically geared towards bringing in private investment, not government aid, but rather private investment to kind of jumpstart the economy. This coincided with also some security measures the Palestinians took in the northern city of Jenin and others. So we're seeing some changes. We're seeing a sense that if you don't change the security reality, the economic reality, that the negotiations that are happening on the political level might not have traction. So I think we're going to be seeing more of these activities. However, the effectiveness of these activities will remain slightly limited unless we have a breakthrough in the on the political negotiations.
But are you concerned that moderates among Palestinians are either losing out or not making the kind of progress that you think should be made?
Well, most certainly. Most certainly. I mean, this is Hamas's central message, that negotiations and diplomacy does not work, and only violence works. And the less that the moderates can show in terms of deliverables, the more that the Hamas and other extremist voices will gain credibility. So as the negotiations continue secretly, and I think that they have to be secret to be effective, we have to have changes on the ground so that the moderates can come to their own publics and say, look, we're succeeding, we're delivering. We saw last week Hezbollah taking over power in Lebanon, Hamas is on the rise, other Islamist movements are on the rise, and there is a sense that the moderates, if they don't deliver now, they might lose out in the long term.
Daniel Kurtzer, should more be done to support moderates in the Palestinian territories?
Oh, for sure. And years have passed in which both the United States and other outside parties have tried their best. A lot of money has gone into the Palestinian Authority for projects designed to create jobs and to give people hope. Unfortunately, not all of that money has been spent as wisely as possible, and a lot of it has dissipated as a result of the violence between the years 2000 and 2004. So, number one, aid needs to continue. Number two, I think the international community also needs to bring some influence to bear on Israel to increase mobility, meaning lifting checkpoints and roadblocks, and they need to increase influence on Palestinians to continue what they've started to do, for example, in the city of Jenin, which is to deploy Palestinian security forces and to indicate that the Palestinian Authority is the only rule of law in town.
You want to speak to that, Ghaith al Omari?
Absolutely. I think one thing that we're seeing among the Palestinian leadership recently is an understanding that if you do not impose security, not for the sake of Israel, but for the sake of creating a functioning government, if you do not do that, then the political process, the negotiation process will go nowhere. So there is a realization among Palestinians they need to do more on security. But as Ambassador Kurtzer just said, there has to be more in terms of freedom of movement, something to show the Palestinians that negotiations are effective and they do pay. But definitely, we have to see more on security. We have to see Israeli action on stopping settlements, which are the biggest impediment to peace. We need to see more on the ground. And what we need to see is a focus by the U.S. administration on these issues. So far, Secretary Rice and President Bush have been focusing on the big negotiations. I think they have to start getting more and more nuts and bolts and making sure that things start changing on the ground.
And nuts and bolts would be things like settlements?
Absolutely. I mean, without settlement freeze, for a Palestinian negotiator, it's very hard to justify to their own public that, to convince their own public that Israel is serious about peace when the settlements continue. If there is no settlement freeze, then it's going to be very difficult to continue the negotiation process. That's a very fundamental aspect of moving forward, just like security. These are two things which are prerequisites for progress.
And Daniel Kurtzer, do you see a freeze on settlements as would be an important breakthrough?
Oh, it certainly would be. The U.S. and others have called for Israel to stop settlement activity, and we've done this over the years consistently. The Israeli argument in response has been that they don't want to take the political risks and undergo the political turmoil of removing settlements in advance of negotiations if they're going to have to remove them later on. It's an argument that makes some sense in the Israeli context, but I think, as Ghaith said, for Palestinians who look out their window, they don't pay much attention to what the negotiators are doing. They're watching the buildings being built and the settlers moving in. So I think it is imperative that we find a way to work with the Israelis to remove the outposts and to stop the increase in the settlement population.
But as you say, Daniel Kurtzer, this has been a policy of United States presidents for some time now, and yet the settlement activity continues.
Well, Marty, one of the things that Scott Lesensky and I argued in the book that we just put out, Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, is that the role of the United States really needs to be more robust. We are seen by both sides as a necessary third party. It doesn't mean we have to be in the room or that we have to be the predominant player, but both sides look to us to help move this thing along, and we have to do better to keep both sides fulfilling the commitments that they've made. Israel has made a commitment to stop settlement activity. This is not a new activity. And the Palestinians have made a commitment to impose security under the authority of the Palestinian government. So in both cases, there is a commitment to be held to, and the United States does have a role to monitor that.
Ghaith, though, do Palestinians see the United States as a neutral, impartial broker?
Oh, absolutely not. But what they're looking for, though, is not an honest broker. They're looking for an effective broker. And the U.S. remains the only effective broker in the game. So, of course, the U.S. Has strategic relations with Israel, and many of us believe that this is a good thing, because this will give the U.S. the kind of influence and leverage vis-a-vis Israel that will help move the process forward. We're not looking for, someone to have a scorecard or to allocate blame. What we're looking for is someone who can work with both parties constructively, and that's the U.S. And one point that Dan mentioned is both the Palestinians and Israelis are hostage to their domestic politics in many of these ways. And sometimes you need a third party to come and get them out of this mindset and make them focus again on the peace process. And the U.S. is the best placed player to do that.
And from the Palestinian perspective, what are those domestic policies that you think are holding Palestinians hostage?
There's the obvious one between Hamas and Fatah, the split that happened recently, the Hamas coup in Gaza. But even within the Fatah ruling party, there are power struggles, there are constituencies that have to be addressed. And so very often the painful concessions that you need to make for moving forward in peace, in a peace process, they hit the wall of public opinion, and you need to manage this public opinion. And you need a third party that will come and give you incentives and packages of incentive, I guess, to allow you to present any difficult concession to your public and to your constituency in a credible way.
Well, and I'm wondering, Daniel Kurtzer, looking at the issue from the Israeli perspective, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert is under a criminal investigation.
Well, I think Ghaith was sounding more like me, the diplomat, in describing domestic challenges. The issues on both sides are far more raw. On the Israeli side, Marty, as you indicated, there's now been a new life given to this investigation of potential corruption against Prime Minister Olmert, with the testimony yesterday of an American who allegedly gave the Prime Minister $150,000, something like that, over the last decade or so. And there are now moves afoot to ask for the Prime Minister's resignation, or at least that he step aside temporarily until the investigation is concluded. So Palestinians clearly will ask, are they dealing with a partner who can run the government? But I think similarly, as Ghaith said diplomatically, the Israelis are asking, do they have a partner that can implement an agreement? President Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, controls the West Bank. There's a lot of ferment even within the West Bank. He certainly doesn't control Gaza. And there's a lot of activity within that community that gives rise to this question. So the domestic political issues here are very, very raw.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's take a very short break. We'll get back to our conversation. Much more to talk about, and that's Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer. He served as U.S. Ambassador to both Israel and Egypt under the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. He's now a professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, co-author of a new book called Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace. Also with us is Ghaith al Omari. He's Advocacy Director of the American Task Force on Palestine, and he was an advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and a Palestinian negotiator from 1999 to 2006, and we are talking about the Arab-Israeli Middle East peace process. Is that possible? 1-888-477-9499. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
People's Light and Theater Company supports WHYY and presents I Have Before Me a remarkable document given to me by a young lady from Rwanda. Inspired by real-life experiences, the play is about a genocide survivor and the teacher who encourages her to write about her experiences. The play speaks to the resiliency of the human spirit and the healing power of telling one's story. Playing through June 22nd. Details at peopleslight.org or 610-644-3500.
This Friday on Radio Times on TV, meet Tony Award-winning actor and theatrical clown Bill Irwin and Barrymore Award-winning actor and mask and puppet maker Aaron Cromie. They'll talk about the making of the Happiness Lecture. Then journalist Howard Feynman talks about the presidential campaign. I'm Marty Moss-Coane, and that's Radio Times on TV, Friday at 8 on WHYY TV 12.
I'm Robin Young. Join us next time for the news and these stories here and now. When a home is foreclosed, vacancies are one problem, but so are squatters and scam artists who move in and sometimes sell foreclosed homes to unsuspecting buyers. Also, the nuts and bolts of staging massive protests. That's Public Radio's daily digest of news and culture here and now.
Today at noon on WHYY.
This is Radio Times here on WHYY in Philadelphia. I'm Marty Moss-Coane, talking with Daniel Kurtzer and Ghaith al Omari about the Middle East peace process, talking about the various meetings that have been held, but also some of the problems and impediments to the peace process. And we've got some open lines at 1-888-477-9499. That's 1-888-477-WHYY. Daniel Kurtzer, Israel has been talking with Syrians, meeting with members of the Syrian government, Turkey playing a kind of a go-between, a broker, having to do with some of these border disputes, these border conflicts. Do you see this as a sign of progress?
Oh, for sure. It's a very good sign. The Syrian-Israeli track has been dormant for more than 8 years, ever since the failure of the Clinton-Assad summit meeting in the spring of 2000. And so any effort now, which looks potentially successful, even to get them talking again, is very good. Marty, you have to remember that in 2000, they were very close to reaching an agreement on all four of the key issues on their agenda, which is withdrawal from Golan, security, water, and political relations. So it may not be easy to reach that final agreement, but seeing how close they had gotten 8 years ago and being frustrated with the fact that we haven't had them talking for the past 8 years, any kind of conversations now are a good thing.
Are you surprised that Turkey is playing this broker role?
No, not at all. The Turks have very significant interests in that region. They border Syria. They've had their own security problems with Syrian support for the Kurdish rebels that plague the Turkish government. Turkey has a good relationship with Israel, and I think given all of these factors, it's a moderate Islamic state. I think it's really well placed to be helpful in this regard.
Barack Obama has talked about talking with Hamas, and Ghaith al Omari, I want to just quote something that you wrote and I'll just quote a couple of sentences here. You said, in any engagement, Hamas, like any rational political actor, will seek to maximize its benefits and minimize its costs. It will use any international dialogue it can achieve to send one overriding message to its local, regional, and global constituencies alike, namely that it can maintain its positions regarding the peace process, Israel, and the use of violence, while at the same time gaining international legitimacy. You go on to say, engaging Hamas without the terms of engagement being clear and without first paying the political price of admission to the international club amounts to a political free lunch. Can you expand on that for us?
I mean, first of all, just a point of fact, I think Obama was very clear that he would not talk to Hamas because Hamas is a terrorist organization by U.S. law in addition to policy. And I think Obama and all of the candidates differentiate between state actors and non-state actors. So that's something that I don't see any change in U.S. policy, irrespective of who the president is, unless Hamas changes. The idea that I was presenting, though, in that argument is that to be a member of the international community, to be a legitimized, accepted member, you have to accept certain rules of the game. No engagement in terrorism, respecting previous agreements, and respecting other states' rights to exist and in safety and security. And unless Hamas does that, the message that will be sent, regionally at least, is that it's okay to engage in terrorism. It's okay to mount coups. It's okay to fire missiles into neighboring countries. You will not pay a price for that. This will destabilize the region. I think you look at countries like Jordan and Egypt and Saudi, and they're watching what's happening with great interest. They see Hezbollah rising in Lebanon. They see Hamas potentially rising in the West Bank and, of course, after controlling Gaza. And they're afraid. They're afraid of having two Iranian-sponsored regimes in the center of the Arab world. This is part of a larger regional trend, and I think unless we start holding these organizations to a standard of international law and a standard of refusing terrorism, rejecting terrorism, we might have a messy situation on our hand in the region. We have to be very clear on what constitutes acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior.
And Dana Kurtzer, early on in the campaign, and I should add that you are a foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama, he did respond to a question about talking with Hamas or Hezbollah, that he would do it without preconditions. Since that time, he has added those preconditions. But could you speak to the policy as you see it, and as it should be?
Marty, actually, I want to underscore the correction that Ghaith made. The senator has distinguished very clearly between his willingness to engage and to do diplomacy without preconditions with countries with whom we have very significant differences. And in this regard, he's talked about a willingness to engage with Iran and other countries like Iran, where our agenda is going to be very tough and the prospects for success are small. But nonetheless, he wants to exhaust all possible avenues for resolving disputes before having to decide whether to resort to the use of force, for example. He has been very clear, however, particularly in the case of Hamas and Hezbollah, that as groups that continue their terrorism, in the case of Hamas refusing also to accept Israel's right to exist, refusing even to accept the legitimacy of agreements into which the Palestinian Authority entered previously, that senator has said he wants the Hamas to change its positions before he would engage. And in this respect, there is a significant difference between, as Ghaith al Omari said, between relations between states and non-state actors. Hamas really has to pay a price for admission into a dialogue, and they seem to think they can get it for free, and there's no reason now to give them that admission.
So what then should the policy be towards Hamas?
Well, I think the policy needs to be directed towards the Palestinian Authority. That's the elected authority of the Palestinian people. Whether through the Annapolis process or some successor process, to try to bring about both changes on the ground that we talked about and an agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and then Hamas will have to make its own decision. Does it want to be part of a mainstream that supports peace, or does it want to stay outside that mainstream and opposing peace? I don't think we need to cater to Hamas's demands at this point. Our focus must be on the Palestinian Authority.
Does the Palestinian Authority, Ghaith, need Hamas? Does the West Bank need Gaza?
Ultimately, yes. Ultimately, a Palestinian state has to include both the West Bank and Gaza, and ultimately the Islamist constituency, which is a considerable constituency, has to be brought in. Now, there's a difference, though, between that constituency and between Hamas as a movement. Hamas, if it decides to drop its weapons, if it decides to recognize Israel and recognize the peace process, will be an integral part and an essential part of the political life of Palestine. Failing to do though, will threaten the very concept of Palestinian statehood. You cannot have a state with two armed groups. You cannot have a state where anyone but the government has a monopoly on violence. And as such, Hamas has a choice to make. But I do agree with the point that Dan made. Ultimately, engaging Hamas is a secondary question. The main question is, if we have a peace process, a successful one, and a peace deal, then Hamas, by definition, will have to be on the defensive. If, however, the peace process falters and the moderates fail to deliver, then Hamas's message will resonate within the public. So the focus should be ensuring that the moderates can achieve results, and that's how the Palestinian politics gets played out. Ultimately, leave Palestinian politics to Palestinians and focus on peacemaking. That would be my message.
Well, but the clock is ticking on that. I mean, it has been ticking for some time now, but the clock is ticking for that, is it not, Ghaith?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we're in a situation where if progress is not made soon, there will be a collapse of the national secular movement in Palestine, which will have repercussions for other moderate regimes. However, I mean, that's the point that I would like to make, though, is just because the clock is ticking, we should not start imposing artificial deadlines. And my main concern right now, I mean, President Bush has said that he wanted a peace deal by the end of the year. I'm afraid of a repeat of what happened during Clinton. I don't want a situation where by the end of the president's term, he will come out and say, well, I tried, the peace process failed. We have to start right now looking at ways of transitioning the peace process to the next president, creating stabilizing situation on the ground whereby the next president comes and will have a conducive environment whereby he or she can can pick up the peace process and move forward with this.
And that's very much what your book is about, Daniel Kurtzer.
Exactly right. We wrote the book thinking about the next administration. We were a bit surprised that this administration actually jumped back into the fray. But Ghaith is exactly right. The time under which this process continues should not be predicated on the American electoral cycle. It would be nice if we made some progress in the next 6 or 7 months. The president clearly wants it for his legacy, and there's no problem with that. But if there fails to be progress in the next 6 or 7 months, I just hope the president doesn't pack up his ideas and walk away with them, but rather leave them for the next administration to build upon and to encourage the parties to make progress.
Should we be surprised that there's so much consensus between the two of you? And as you say, meetings are going on privately and in secret. But do you think there is more consensus out there than we've been led to believe, Daniel Kurtzer?
I think there is. You know, we've said, American officials and academics have said for some time that we think that there's a great deal of consensus in both communities, both with regard to process and with regard to the shape of a final outcome. Just recently, a colleague of ours who participated in the book, Shibli Telhami of the University of Maryland, published the results of a poll conducted in the Arab world in which more than 2/3 of the respondents talked positively about the prospects for peace between Arabs and Israel. So I think there's a readiness on the part of Arab publics. There's a kind of an agreement that's emerging on the process by which this is going to get done. And I think we're going to find that there's an amazing amount of similarity in views about the contours of a final settlement. What's missing still is the political will of the leadership in the region to take those final steps and bridge those final differences. And it's a tough thing to do, but that's really where we have to focus our efforts.
And I do want to get to our callers, but Ghaith, I want to give you a chance to find out whether you agree with Daniel Kurtzer with his assessment about this level of agreement.
Oh, absolutely. Anyone who's been doing this business for a while knows what an end game would look like, what peace would look like, knows what needs to be done to get there. The problem is not in terms of substance or agreeing on the goals. The problem is political. And the one thing that I would disagree with Dan on is I don't think it's only political will, it's often political ability as well. I mean, I have no doubt that President Abbas wants it, that Prime Minister Olmert wants it, and President Bush wants it. Are they capable, and do they have the skill to do it, is a different story.
That's Ghaith al Omari, Advocacy Director of the American Task Force on Palestine. Also with us, Daniel Kurtzer, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel and Egypt. He's now a professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School, author of a new book, or co-author, I should say, a book called Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, and that is exactly what we're talking about here on Radio Times. And we do have just a couple open lines at 1-888-477-9499. That's 1-888-477-WHY. Why? Let's get some callers into the conversation. Then I would like to just sort of use the West Bank as an example and talk to both of you about how you see the peace process and how that would work and what it would look like. But first, we've got Lou from Center City, Philadelphia, joining us. Hi, Lou. Go ahead. You're radio.
Good morning, everyone. Great topic. I have a question in reference to the classification of, two questions. Classification of Palestinian military activity as terrorism, since they don't have a standing army. How do you actually come to terms with that? And in reference to Hamas, how do you not contribute funds as we did after it was a democratically elected election that brought them to power?
Okay, Lou, thanks for calling into Radio Times. Ghaith al Omari, what do you call Hamas?
Terrorist organization, definitely and clearly. An organization that engages in indiscriminate attacks against civilians for political purposes is a terrorist organization. I mean, there's no doubt about that in my mind. In terms of, though, Hamas is more than a terrorist organization. It's also a political organization that has a constituency. And as the caller rightly said, they did win an election. However, democracy is more than election. Democracy is about behavior, about accepting certain rules of the game, certain international obligations. Hamas played one part of the democratic game, which is elections, but then refused to play the other part of being a responsible political player. So it remains a terrorist organization, and it remains an organization that is unwilling to abide by the basic rules of the game.
But do you think, in a democracy, people do get to vote for their leaders, and that if leaders don't deliver on promises or goods or services, that people can go back and vote them out of office?
Absolutely. And Hamas did win an election. However, at the same time, a country like the U.S. or the European Union or most of the world has a right to not deal with a government that does not accept the basic rules of the international community. And this is what happened. Hamas won the election, refused to renounce violence, refused to recognize Israel or to recognize previous agreements. So the international community decided that they will not deal with a government of this sort. This is where we are right now. There's no obligation for the U.S. or others to deal with an organization that refuses to share their basic values.
Let me get to Paul from Bristol to join us. Lou, thanks for the call. Paul, go ahead. Your Radio Times.
Hi, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
To me, this is such a high-minded discussion. It's a pleasure to listen to.
Thank you.
I have to ask the question, since it seems that historically it has been Israel that has been attacked and has been the subject of a movement to destroy it. Israel hasn't been moving to destroy Egypt or destroy Syria or destroy anybody, I guess, really. Israel, I think, is rightfully worried and afraid, and I think that with it being such a narrow country, 8 miles or 10 miles or 15 miles from where Tel Aviv is to where the Palestinian country would be, I think Palestinians must know that Israelis will just not accept a powerful military there. Israelis know this.
Paul?
Palestinians know this.
Paul?
I just wonder how far they trust each other or can trust each other.
Knowing, of course, the history, the politics, the geography, and all of that. Daniel Kurtzer?
Yes, and the other thing, and I'm sorry, I don't want to take a bunch of your time, but if Israelis do relax checkpoints and make movement easier, do you think it's possible that that can happen and there won't be an upclimb in violence and bombings and so forth?
Ambassador Kurtzer, your thoughts?
Marty, Paul has put his finger on a very critical issue, and it's one that I faced while I was serving as ambassador during the period of the Palestinian Intifada. In discussions that I had with Prime Minister Sharon about issues like checkpoints and roadblocks, the Prime Minister asked that same question. If I lifted a roadblock, would we have a suicide bomber attacking Israel the next day? And I think under these circumstances, the issue of security is not just a rhetorical problem for both sides. Ghaith al Omari said earlier a very important point, that Palestinians have to make a decision to provide security within their society, not because of Israel, but because of their own requirements. There has to be one legitimate government within Palestine that can impose its police and security function will on the population, and in doing so, that would move a great deal towards meeting Israel's concerns.
But do you think, and we're almost up on a break here, Daniel Kurtzer, from your perspective, are they up to the task?
I think with some time they can be. You know, there's an American general out there now, Keith Dayton, who has been involved in equipping and training Palestinian security forces, and he's making small progress. We're going to have to do a lot more. But if you look at, I mentioned Jenin earlier on, a city in the northern West Bank, the Palestinian security forces are starting to deploy, and they're actually starting to operate. So if this becomes a sign of the times, then I can be optimistic, but there's a lot of work left to be done.
Paul, thanks for the call to Radio Times. We're going to take another short break, get back to our conversation with Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer and Ghaith al Omari. We are talking about the Middle East peace process, talking about progress on the ground in some instances, but certainly problems and barriers in other instances. 1-888-477-9499. That's 1-888-477-WHYY. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Christiana Care supports WHYY and your efforts to stay healthy. Christiana Care is offering a free online heart risk assessment available at christianacare.org/heart test. By answering a few questions about your health and lifestyle, you can find out if you could be at risk for heart disease. Online at christianacare.org/heart test for an online heart risk assessment.
This week on This American Life, for David, prom night was the culmination of years of effort.
You know, I changed a lot. Since sophomore year, I got into this crowd and stuff, and they just changed. I changed my speech, my dress, and all that stuff. I'm still the same person. I just changed. This is a popular crowd. I'm just popular now. The most gorgeous girl in school. I asked her at prom. She says yes.
Prom night. Damn. Prom night this week.
Tonight at 10 on WHYY.
Get ready to be provoked.
For Osama bin Laden, the American occupation of Iraq was a dream come true.
Fascinated.
I wanted to make white mothers understand what we were going through.
And inspired.
I'll give her a kiss. Wake up, honey. I'm here.
It's the latest news and a whole lot more.
It was probably one of the most unbelievable feelings I've ever had in my life.
On NPR's Day to Day.
This afternoon at 1 on WHYY.
This is Radio Times here on WHYY in Philadelphia. I'm Marty Moss-Cohen, and if you're just joining us, we're talking with Ghaith al Omari today on the show, Advocacy Director of the American Task Force on Palestine, and Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, former U.S. Ambassador to both Israel and Egypt. He's a professor at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School. He's got a new book that he's co-authored with Scott Liszewski called Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, and that's our topic of conversation. 1-888-477-9499. Let me get Nathaniel from West Philadelphia to join us. Nathaniel, go ahead. You're on Radio Times.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. I wanted to know why no one has talked about the refugee question, the over 4 million refugees that are living in camps that are descendants of the 700,000 plus refugees that were expelled in 1948 through a policy of ethnic cleansing that's been well documented in Alain Papet's book, The Israeli Historian. It's called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Well, it's a good question, ones we've talked about before, and certainly is one of those issues that is on the table for negotiation. But let me get Ghaith al Omari just to respond to your question there, Nathaniel. Thanks for the call to Radio Times. Ghaith, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of refugees, as you mentioned, is one of the main issues, along with Jerusalem and the borders, that have to be settled in the ongoing negotiations. It's one of the tougher issues, and it's tough because the Palestinians and the Israelis have very different views of what happened in 48. The caller mentioned one view, which is the more Palestinian-oriented view, but there's an Israeli view as well. There's an Israeli narrative, and the problem is how do you reconcile these narratives. And I think what we're hearing is that the two sides are taking a very interesting approach right now to the issue. They're not discussing history. They're not discussing who was right or wrong in 1948. They're discussing solutions. And we know what the solution is. The solution is, based on the two-state solution, the Palestinian refugees will have the right to return to the Palestinian state. They will have the right to compensation, but they will be limited, if any, return to Israel. Irrespective of this is being fair or unfair, this is the only way that we can get a deal. And this is one of these things where fairness and history have to make space for what is practical, what is doable, and what can build a stable future.
And the compensation comes from Israel, comes from...
I think these are details that are being discussed. The Palestinian position has been that Israel will have to be part of the compensation package as a symbolic gesture, recognizing some responsibility to what happened in 1948. But these are details that will have to be discussed. Ultimately, a lot of the money will have to come from international community, and Israel will probably have to contribute something.
Well, Daniel Kircher, as you said, and frankly both of you have said, and Daniel Kircher, you've said this before on Radio Times, which is the most people sort of know what the end game is, what everyone has to figure out how to get to, and that would be a two states living side by side. There have to be some kind of resolution about settlements. The Palestinian refugee question has to be solved. There's also the question of Jerusalem, and I know that's something that you have talked about and written about. How do you see that?
I think that Jerusalem is going to end up being the the final issue on the agenda. I think, as Ghaith al Omari just noted, there are ways to deal with the refugee issue. They may not be seen as fully satisfying some people's narratives, but you can come up with functional proposals that are acceptable. Jerusalem has so many different dimensions to it that it makes it far more complicated. It's not just an Israeli-Palestinian issue. It cuts across the three Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. There are players outside the Middle East who have very deep roots and connections in that city. And it's going to take a tremendous amount of creativity and perhaps even a possibility of deferring a final outcome and working out arrangements that change the way people live together in order to give some time for the conflict to kind of go away while we think about dealing with Jerusalem. Back in 2000, President Clinton had some ideas about splitting the outside neighborhoods in Jerusalem according to demographic criteria. And that works, but as you move in closer to the most holy sites and the most contentious places, the creative juices are going to really have to flow on that one.
Well, is it instructive, and I'll put this to both of you, and Ghaith, perhaps I'll start with you, but is it instructive to, let's look at the West Bank, and from your perspective, what would then the process of the transfer of power look like?
And first of all, you would need a deal, an agreement that defines what the borders are. Because without that, it will always be murky, which areas we're going to transfer, which settlements we're going to dismantle. So we need that piece of paper. And then there will have to be a process of transfer based on capacity. I mean, I think that Israelis will not hand over territory if the Palestinians can't control the territory. And I would argue that many of the Palestinians also believe that they don't want to get territory that they cannot protect. So they will have to have a process of parallel process of peace deal, but also building the capacity of the Palestinians to be able to govern and to control security. There might be some international assistance in this effort. There might be some international forces to be deployed temporarily. There are ways of doing it, but what you need is definitely a clear delineation of the borders.
Something along those 1967 lines?
Yes. I mean, I think there's agreement by all players that 67 is the baseline for a thing. Then there will have to be some areas that will be annexed to Israel. I mean, there are around 400,000 Israeli settlers. It's unlikely that Israel will be able to remove all of them, and I think it might be even politically undesirable for Israel to move all of them. Some will be annexed to Israel, and you can annex a big majority in only 1.5 or 2% of the West Bank. And Israel has to compensate the Palestinians with equal land from within Israel. There will be a land swap, basically.
Daniel Kircher, I'm thinking about the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and those images of Israeli settlers being dragged from their homes. Is there a way to avoid that when looking at the West Bank?
Well, at the end of the day, it may look the same. You had actually in Gaza a a relatively peaceful withdrawal of the settlers. Of course, the media covered those cases where individuals stayed in their homes to the last minute, but it was a remarkably violence-free process. The West Bank is going to be tougher. I think if the areas that Ghaith al Omari suggested are involved in swaps can be agreed, you end up not minimizing the problem or having it go away, but at least you keep it within reasonable dimensions. But I think at the end of the day, you're talking about people who may be living there now 2 generations, since 1968, 69, and it's going to be very hard to convince them that a piece of paper, even with the political buy-in of a referendum or an election, will actually substitute for what they perceive to be a religious or other kind of commitment they have to that land.
So, I mean, where would that leave then some of those outpost settlements, the ones that are not close to Israel, but in the middle of the West Bank somewhere?
Well, the Israeli government has been very confident and firm in implementing agreements which it has signed with Egypt, with Jordan, and in the case of the Gaza disengagement, where it took a unilateral decision. And so I think if you do have that agreement, if you do have a process both in Israel and the Palestinian Authority in which the population says, yes, we want this implemented, I think the Israeli government will do what's necessary. Part of it will not look pretty. There's going to be a lot of very angry, unhappy, sad people on the Israeli side, but Israeli governments have taken decisions and implemented them in the past. It's a responsible state, and I think we would expect that in this case as well.
Let me get to Fred from Chadds Ford in on the conversation. Fred, go ahead, your Radio Times.
Well, thank you. First, thanks for a great program.
Thank you.
I guess I have 3 comments to make. First of all, this whole idea of fairness, let's not fix blame, let's find a solution. It seems to me that I remember in 1967, Palestinians coming into my father's home and saying, I still have the key to my house in Haifa. Well, that's a person you could never make peace with.
Well,
Today, those people are coming in and saying, I have the key to my grandfather's house in Haifa. Well, that's a guy who's never been there. That person you can make peace with. So I think there's a pragmatic aspect to it.
Okay, fair
enough. The second thing is much more charged, and that's this. We always talk about the Arabs recognizing Israel's right to exist. Most Arabs view the creation of Israel as being out of violence and a crime against the Arabs. But there's a big difference between recognizing Israel's right to exist and the Arabs recognizing Israel's existence. Again, if people want peace, if the Arabs and the Israelis want peace in the area, it's not really a question of saying the Israelis are right, the Arabs were wrong, whatever. It's really a question of saying, let's make peace, let's recognize each other's rights to go forward, not necessarily that the creation of the state. And I think this goes back to the commentator's point about the political will involved. It's a big step. There's a huge chasm to cross to get the political leadership to say, yes, we acknowledge Israel's right to be there.
Well, you know what, Fred, let me just stop you there.
Requirement and say instead.
Let me just stop you there because I want to pick up on what I think is your essential question, and I'll put this to you, Ghaith al Omari, and I do hope I've been pronouncing your name correctly during this hour, but we'll fix that at the end of the show. He's wondering, will Arabs accept Israel's right to exist?
I actually tend to agree with the caller in that it's not necessary. I mean, peace does not equal love. Peace equals workable relations between 2 countries that can create stability, and hopefully this in the future will develop into more deeper sense of acceptance. But what we need right now is workable, stable arrangements. In the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan, neither of these accepted Israel's right to exist. They accepted Israel as a political player, as a state in the region. So I think this is more about semantics. And the more we stay away from charged terms, and the more we stay away from notions of fairness and of historical narratives, the more able we will be to reach a deal.
What do you think, Daniel Kurtzer?
Look, I think Ghaith's exactly right. There are a lot of hardline nationalist Israelis who basically say, why should we be the only country in the world that has to ask other people to tell us that we have a right to exist? We exist because we're here and because we have legitimacy and the United Nations has admitted us and all the rest. So it becomes an emotional question. It's part of the politics that surrounds this process. But I think if we can get into a serious implementation phase where the two sides are working hard on fixing problems and implementing an agreement, some of these semantical issues will, in fact, just go by the wayside.
Let me ask you both, but I'll start with you, Daniel Kurtzer. Former President Jimmy Carter said recently, I believe he was in Great Britain, said that Israel has 150 nuclear weapons, and this is something that Israel has never publicly acknowledged. And although I think there's been some degree of, this is a word I came across, nuclear ambiguity when it has come to Israel. First of all, what do you make of Jimmy Carter's statement?
It's hard to make anything reasonable out of what former President Carter's been saying lately. He's all over the universe in talking about these issues, and how he would know that there's one or 150 such weapons is really beyond me. The larger issue here, though, has to do with a question of a nuclear-free Middle East at some point in the future. Israel, if it does have nuclear weapons, argues that it becomes the last line of defense and kind of the first line of deterrence against a crazy state or organization that may have the ability to cause significant, perhaps existential damage. What happens if one can foresee in some number of years that those kinds of threats get removed because we have a process of peacemaking and rebuilding of trust where those kinds of weapons are not needed? So I think it would be advisable if President Carter focused on something else for the time being. He's not making much sense on these issues, and let's get down to the nitty-gritty of trying to resolve some of the peace issues.
Ghaith al Omari, how did you read President Carter's statement?
First of all, I admire the ambassador's diplomatic way of putting it.
There's a lot of diplomacy going on in the show today, but go ahead.
No, I mean, I tend to agree. At the end of the day, look, the working assumption is that Israel has nuclear weapons. No one knows how many. However, this has been used in a very disturbing way recently, and this has been used as a way of somehow justifying Iran and others gaining nuclear capacity. The fact that Israel has nuclear capacity doesn't give a justification to the other players in the region to get nuclear capability. And I think that has to be very careful. The objective has to be a nuclear-free Middle East, not a Middle East where we have more and more nuclear weapons. So I think that President Carter, he's well-intentioned, I have no doubt about that, but he has not been helpful recently, whether with this, whether in terms of calling Israel an apartheid state, whether in terms of meeting with Hamas leaders. So I think he should maybe leave this alone for a while.
And I know it's always dangerous to ask a question about predicting peace in the Middle East. We have about a minute to go. Daniel Kurtzer, do you see signs of progress and optimism?
Yes, and there's no reason not to believe that it can continue. If the negotiations underway between Israelis and Palestinians can keep chipping away at this, if the beginning of negotiations between Israel and Syria can get us back to where we were in 2000 and see if we can't resolve some of those outstanding issues, then why not? Why not think about the possibility of agreements which then become politically sensitive, but they're far more beneficial to be working on than the alternative. So, yeah, I'm a little optimistic that we can make progress now.
And Ghaith al Omari, giving you the last chance in about 20 seconds.
You have to be optimistic to be in this business. Otherwise, you would quit a long time ago. I think there is a chance for peace. However, it's not inevitable. And what I would the message I would leave with your listeners is, if you consider the alternative to peace, then peace, hard as it may be, becomes desirable. The alternative is too scary to even consider.
Well, I appreciate both of you joining us today on Radio Times. I've learned a lot. Ghaith al Omari, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
And Daniel Kurtzer, thank you very much as well.
Nice to talk to you, Marty.
Nice to talk to both of you, actually. And Ghaith will figure out how to pronounce your name. We will fix that the next go-around. Ghaith al Omari, Advocacy Director of the American Task Force on Palestine, and Daniel Kurtzer, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel and Egypt, co-author of a new book called Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East. Go to whyy.org/Radio Times. I'm Marty Moss-Coane, and you're listening to WHYY FM Philadelphia, your member-supported news and information station serving Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And do stay with us for the second hour of Radio Times. Today we'll be talking about green jobs and a new, greener economy. The Franklin Institute forecast for today, sunshine, a bit less humid than yesterday, high of 73 degrees. Tonight, clear, low 49. Thursday, sunshine, high of 77. Friday, sun, then increasing clouds, high of 78. Saturday, partly